If you're thinking about deploying Django, Python, PHP, React, the likelihood is that you're going to need to deploy and configure a web server. Like anything, there are plenty of technologies to choose from, whether you choose Nginx, Apache, Sun, Google, Cloudflare, OpenResty. There are plenty of web servers that are going to help provide you achieve your goals of serving your web service. According to statistics, Nginx continues to be the most commonly used web server, with around about 32% of all sites using it. Nginx can be utilized for a range of different needs, whether you're just trying to serve a web page, whether you need reverse proxying, caching, load balancing. There's a whole host of different services that Nginx can provide. Let's just take a quick look at where Nginx fits into a general request response cycle for serving a web page. A user from a browser would make a request. Maybe that's a post or a GET request for some sort of web page. So this is where Nginx comes into play. You can see this is a vital cog in that cycle of retrieving data from the server. Nginx will handle the request from the browser. Depending on your implementation, you may have some intermediate server, which is going to allow you to, in this case, translate or communicate with Python, UWSGI server. So at the back end, you may have Django, Python, React, PHP running. You may have some sort of file server and database. And then that data then gets served back through Nginx back to the browser. So hopefully this diagram just emphasizes, in order for your application to perform effectively, it's not just going to rely on your application. It's also going to rely potentially on the web server. Your ability to configure for high performance, maybe load balancing, for security, for traffic management. There's a whole heap of information and setup here potentially that needs to be considered before you start deploying your application at scale. So with that said, welcome. My name is Xander. Welcome to the Nginx Mastery series, where initially I'm going to deliver a 3-part series. First of all, getting started with Nginx, and then we'll move into Nginx architecture in the second tutorial, and then thirdly, look at serving static content. Once we finish this 3-part series, I would then continue to deliver content about Nginx, looking at very specific areas and aspects managing and administrating Nginx services. In this tutorial, for beginners, we start by starting an Nginx server. And here we're going to be utilizing Docker. So we get straight into building and working with Nginx. You will need to have Docker installed. So I'm assuming that you have installed Docker Desktop. If you're new to Docker, then just go over to Google, type in Docker Desktop and download that. So we'll go through the basics of setting Docker up with Nginx. And then we'll have a look at managing the Nginx service, and then finally serving custom web pages. So this is a little bit more detail exactly what we're going to be covering in this tutorial. So getting started with Docker and Nginx. Essentially, that's what we're going to be covering in the first 3 tutorials. This is the first tutorial here. So we go and start off by pulling the image down from Docker. We'll run Nginx container, and then we'll start to look at how we can start and stop utilizing Docker, how to verify your installation, make sure everything is working okay. Then we go through some basic service management, start, stop, and have a look at some of the basic commands we can utilize. And then finally, we'll then move into starting to learn a little bit about the Nginx default folder. How can we serve web pages directly from Nginx? And then we go through and Dockerize that using volumes, and then create our own custom page. And then finally build our own Nginx image. Okay, so that's the plan for the first tutorial. So let's get started. So like I said, if you haven't already got Docker installed, you are going to need to install that. I won't take you through that process. Simply go to Google, type in Docker Desktop, download it for your distribution, and then just go through the installation guide. If you're running Windows or Mac, it literally just is a case of next, next, and next. If you're on Linux, it can be a little bit more tricky, but there are some good documentation on the Docker website. So I have Visual Studio Code open in the terminal here. Now, you don't need to use Visual Studio Code for this. It's just that it's just nicely centralized, everything in the same place. So I've opened up a new folder here. The first thing I need to do to start working with Nginx, you don't have to do this, of course, but here I'm going to be utilizing Docker. That makes it a little bit more palatable for all operating systems, and it can be a bit of a pain in. You won't necessarily want to have to install Nginx on your own machine, and obviously that allows us to containerize Nginx and work with it. And we can save the image to Docker, and we can then share it with everyone else. It just makes it a lot easier to work, I think, in containers rather in our own operating system. So let's get started by pulling down Nginx, the official Nginx image from Docker. So if you are new to Docker and images, essentially what we're going to be doing here is utilizing Docker Hub. So the developers of Nginx have created an image which basically has everything we need to get started utilizing Nginx. So essentially all we need to do is download that image and then start it in a container, which is essentially running the image. And then that inside of that container will have everything that we need to actually run the service. So essentially it's running a small computer inside of a container. And in this case, we're just going to be running the Nginx service within that container. And that saves us from having to download, install into our own computer and so on. So you can see that we have the official Nginx image here. It's got 1 billion downloads plus, so it's quite popular. So we're going to go ahead and just download that. If I click on this image here, this is in Docker Hub, you can see that we're provided the actual command that we're going to need to pull that down. So let's go ahead and do that. So just paste that into there. So it's around about, I don't know, it's around about 100 meg. So that's downloaded. I go over then to Docker Desktop and go into my images, and you can see that I've now downloaded that image and it's now available. So all I really need to do now is to run this image with a few different attributes, parameters, pass in a few parameters, and then our Nginx server will be running. So let's go ahead and do this. Now imagine that you're new to Docker here. So we use Docker to instruct that we want to use a Docker command. And then what we want to do is we want to run that image that we've just downloaded. Okay, so we do want some sort of interaction. So IT is basically going to instruct Docker to allocate a sudo tty connection, or essentially it's going to allow us to have an interactive bash shell in the container so we can interact with our image through, our container through a shell. So IT. Right, so after that, let me think, we're going to need to -rm. So here rm, we may want to run this command again. So this is essentially going to remove any kind of stopped containers that we might have, or clean up the containers and remove the file system if the container exists already. Okay, so next up, we want to run this service as a persistent kind of background process. So we're going to use /d here for daemon, and so we're going to run it as a daemon. And then next up, let's go for p. So we're going to need to define the ports that we want to use. So first of all, we define the port we want to access it from our own computer. So we're going to use port 8080. You can use port 8000 if you want. Let's just go ahead and do that. And then we want to define what port we want to access inside of our container. So we want to kind of map that over to the port 80 in the container, because that's where our server is running by default. So if you're not already familiar with this, our web applications tend to run, or the web tends to run on port 80. So therefore our server needs to be listening on port 80. So it's expecting information in port 80. So a HTTP request, for example. So that then allows us to interact with our container from our machine 8000, and that gets then translated to the container to port 80. And then we can give it a name. So let's call this name website, for example. And then we want to define the image we want to use. And the image is called Nginx, so we use that. So that's going to start then that's going to then grab this container, this image, and create a new container running the image. So we now have our container running, and it's running on port 8000. So let's go into the browser. Let's open up a new tab here, and then let's go to localhost. That was 8080. That was the wrong site. 8000. And there we go. So we're welcome to Nginx, and you can see that everything is now working. For those who are new to Docker, you can see that when we go into Docker Desktop here, not only do we have access now to the image, we can go ahead and delete that, we can also access the container, start, stop, restart. So there's a whole heap of different tools here we have available to interact with our container. In this tutorial, we'll be utilizing the Docker extension in Visual Studio Code. And you can see once you've got that installed, so go over to extensions, type in Docker here, install that. Once you've got that installed, you can see that we have access here to our images and containers, and that can make it easier to access the files within the container, for example. So you can see we can access all the files within this container, and I can also then right click and start and stop and restart, attach a shell, so I can use a shell directly here. And it does make it a little bit easier in some cases to work with the container directly within Visual Studio Code. So whatever you want to do, very easy to start and stop this. We can simply just right click and stop, or go over to a Docker Desktop and stop. Or in addition to that, we can use commands, and we'll learn them a little bit later, to start and stop our Docker container or our instance. Now, typically, if we do stop Nginx service, that will then stop the container. So we'll see that in action later, but that's generally how you're going to start and work with your Docker container. So let's talk a little bit about verifying the installation. Well, we've already seen that once we've installed the image or downloaded and started the container, we can use our browser and then hop over to the port that we define. In this case, we defined port 8000, and you've seen that we can then access our service. We can also use curl. If you're using Windows, you probably won't be able to do this directly, but we can just say, for example, localhost, curl localhost 8000, and you can see that we're returning the information as we would do in the browser, but here in the terminal, and you can see we're returning the HTML for the page. So we can also check the version of Nginx by running an Nginx command here, the vflag. So to do that, what we're going to need to do is right click here, assuming you've got this installed, the Docker extension installed, we can attach a shell. So that's going to give me command line access directly into the container. So I can do the same thing if I'm using Docker Desktop here. I can select the CLI. That will open up a CLI into the container. Right, so from here, I can then type in Nginx MV, and that will then give me the version of Nginx that's installed, verifying that we've installed Nginx. If we wanted to go a little bit deeper and have a look at the actual services that are running, what we can do is use docker top web. So that one needs to be done in our bash shell. So docker and then top. And now our service is called website. So let's call this website. And you can see from this little list here, all the services, you can see all the services that are running here. And we'll go into the detail of this. You notice here we've got 4 Nginx workers, and we have an Nginx master process. In the second tutorial, we'll go into a little bit more detail, exactly what that is and how to manage these workers and what this master process actually does. But it's a good insight at the beginning, just looking at this initially, as to where we're going in the second tutorial, and just verify exactly what Nginx services are available. Okay, so now we've verified the installation. Let's talk just a little bit about basic service management commands. So starting and stopping. So here we have some Nginx basic commands, start and stop. So these commands, again, these are going to need to be performed actually in the shell, the interactive shell in our container. So let's go ahead and just type in these commands. So Nginx start. Now it's already started, of course, so we don't actually need that command. So we also have stop. So notice at the moment it does say invalid command. So let's type in service Nginx stop. So this time, notice that it does actually work, and you can see that the terminal will close, blah, blah, blah. Well, notice here on the left-hand side, I do have my Docker container or my Docker extension running, and notice now that the container has stopped. So that when we do actually stop the service, it does actually then terminate the container. So if you do want to restart, then you just need to go through the same process that we did before. Now, I'm just going to close the shell. That was the shell corresponding to the container, which doesn't exist anymore. And then let's just clear all this here. So if I press up, if you're not familiar with this, this was the previous command we utilized to actually run the container. And you can see that that then runs, and we have exactly the same instance. So remember, what we have here is an image that we've downloaded. That image has everything pre-created. So when we make the container, we're essentially using that image to build the container. So every time we build the container at this point, it's going to be exactly the same. The only differences that we can make are the parameters that we can pass in. So for example, here, the name and the ports that we want to use. Now, if you want to utilize this further, you can go over to the Nginx image, or the information, sorry, on the Docker hub. Have a look at Nginx, see if we can quickly find it. You can find more information about it on the hub here. So it's going to provide a little bit more information about the commands that you can utilize and how you can interact with this image by default. So you'll find that on Docker Hub, and then type in Nginx. So just to talk a little bit about some of the Nginx commands, so we can get familiarized with that. So here, let's go back into our container. So we're going to attach a shell again. We can run these commands here. So here we can type in Nginx and then H. So that's going to provide us, or it's going to show us all the Nginx help menu. So we've already seen or utilized V. So that provided us the version. Now there is a capital version, so let's go ahead and do that. That's going to provide us basically a little bit more information. So it's going to provide the Nginx version. It's going to provide other information such as the build information, some of the configuration arguments, and the modules are built into the Nginx binary. So a little bit more information by utilizing the capital V. Now, eventually we're moving to creating our custom configurations. So potentially we're going to need T here. So this is basically going to check the syntax, like it says here, and test our configuration file to make sure that everything is potentially in order for us to actually start the server and work with the server. So we also have the capital T, and again, like the capital V, that's going to provide us a little bit more information. So in this case, what we're looking at here is a printout of the validated configuration. So here, for example, you can see that, let's see if we can go back up here. You can see that the server is listening on port 80. So it's going to be listening on port 80. We know that because we're passing, if you remember, port 8000 on our machine over to 80. The server name is localhost. That's why we typed in localhost and then port 8000, which then gets translated to 80 here on the server. So that's where the server is listening. So it's accepting requests from this port and this server name. So you can see some other information like access logs, which won't be covering in this tutorial, and also some locations. So next up, we're going to be talking about locations or default locations. And that's where Nginx looks for data to serve directly to you. So what we saw originally, if we go back to the browser, was this welcome Nginx. So this page here is an index. This is an index.html page, the default page that was found in this folder. And we can see here that Nginx here is looking for two files to begin with. So Nginx will automatically serve a page. When we type in domain.com, whatever domain it is, it serves a default page. And this page here is going to be, or it's set up to be, HTML or HTML index. So those are the first two pages that Nginx looks for. And of course, this is all configurable. So this service works with signals. So we'll learn a little bit more about signals in the second tutorial, but we can utilize the S flag to send a signal. So let's, for example, send a signal to stop. And you can see that will then stop the process. So the S flag allows us to send a signal. Then there's many different signals that we can send. Stop, quit, reload, reopen, for example. So like I said, we'll learn a little bit more about that in the second tutorial, but that was the last flag that we could utilize. Okay, so let's move on to the default folder. So I've already introduced the default folder. We've already seen that in the configuration file, what that potentially means. So let's go over back into our shell here. We're just going to run the server again. Now, again, you are going to need Docker extension to see this, and this just makes it nice and easy to work with the folder inside of the container. So this is a new container we've just started again. So if I go in here, you can see that we can access the files in the container. So this very much looks like a Linux installation. These files are synonymous of kind of a Linux installation here. And you can see that if we traverse into the folder, so if you remember, we need to go into the folder and look for the default directory. So that's user share nginx, and HTML. So let's go into that. So user, where are we? User, and then inside of here, we've got share. And then we're looking for nginx. So it's all in alphabetical order, of course. And then inside of here, we have the HTML folder. So this is the root directory, the default directory Nginx looks to serve web content. And you can see we have this index page. Now we can go ahead and open it up. So we can download and open. So let's go ahead and open. And you can see that we have this page here. And let's just get rid of all this here. And we'll just end up with that. So we've just customized it slightly. So I press save there, although I do have auto save turned on and it's always recommended. So with that done, let's go back, make sure our container is working. So our container is running. So let's go back into the browser here and refresh. And you can see that does have an instant change. That does, change the outcome. So you can see that we are actually working with this file on a live server. So what we want to do now is kind of copy this folder over to our root here so that we can work more interactively, because we don't want to have to keep going into that folder to make changes. We want to essentially be able to work directly in our root here, in our own folder, and copy everything across. So this is where we can utilize Docker volumes. So next up, what we're going to do here is we're going to start to utilize Docker in a slightly different way to start to lead towards building our own Nginx image so that we can start to prepare our custom version of Nginx with our own configuration in preparation for us to then actually serve that or deploy that onto our own server. Because what we got at the moment is we've just got the basic Nginx image. So if we go back here into our images, this is just the default image with the default setup. And of course, we want to customize that in preparation for actually to serve our own website. So let's start by going into our Explorer here. So back on the folder here. So that takes us into the folder that we've connected to in our desktop. So I'm going to create two new files here. So docker compose.yaml file. So configuration here for our Docker service, our Nginx service. And then just because we're going to lead towards this anyway, I'm going to make a DockerFile as well. So there's no file extension for that, just DockerFile. So we'll start with this, the DockerFile. So we are going to be utilizing, in this case, the Nginx image, right? So that's pretty much the base image that we're going to use for everything. And that, let's just define the latest version. So that's the image that we're currently using. Right. So that provides us a little bit of context just for now. And like I said, we'll move into that in a little bit more shortly. Right. So let's go ahead and define a service. Okay. And that service is going to be called Nginx. And then we're going to go ahead and when we build, we want context. So basically what we're doing here is saying that when we build this service, we're going to utilize this Docker file. And this Docker file is basically just saying use this image for now. So that's the image that we're going to use. All right, so this is like the how we're going to build our image. So we're going to define some of the different parameters. So essentially we are going to start the service from this file. So we need to define the ports like we did with the command here, but we're not going to use this command anymore. We're just going to have this static, if you like, in this file. So let's just define the ports again. And then this time we're going to define the volume. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new folder. A new folder. I'm going to call this HTML. And I'm just going to map this HTML folder, over to the default folder in Nginx container. So we're going to map our folder here, our HTML folder, over to the Nginx HTML folder. That's the plan. Right, so what we're going to need to say is ./HTML/, so that's our folder here. And then we're going to need to map that across. So :/user. So this is just the path on the container where our folder, HTML folder, is found. Okay, so we've now kind of mapped across our folder here to the container. So what we need to do now is just make sure that our container is stopped. So let's just stop that. So that's that stop now. Okay, so with that done, I think we're now ready to start this. So what we can do is we can just type in docker compose, and then we can just say build. Although in this case we probably don't need to do that. So let's just say up. Now notice this time we get all this other information. So basically this is what you're looking at here is basically the output from the container. So we don't have to look at that. Notice that it takes up our command prompt, so we can kind of hide all that if we want to. If you remember, what we did was we started our container as a daemon. So we can do exactly that. So use the D flag again, and you can see now we've run the service, but it's running as a daemon in the background. So everything is up and running. So notice here we've got this container here called intro Nginx and Nginx. So that's kind of the name here that we're utilizing for this container. And so let's go back into our browser here and restart, and notice that we get forbidden. So why is that the case? Well, what's happened here is that we've mapped across a folder called HTML to the HTML folder in Nginx. But the problem is here, there's nothing inside of this folder. So in actual fact, what we've done is we've basically made a copy of this folder over here, and it's removed all the files in the initial image. So therefore we have nothing inside of this folder. And that's why we're receiving a 403, because there's no file there. And we don't currently have a setup by default that allows us to view the directory. So we get forbidden. Right, so let's go back inside of here. We'll create a new file inside of our HTML folder. Let's call this index.html. Now, as soon as we created this file, it is mapping it across to the folder. So we've created a link. So we are kind of copying that across to our container, So let's go ahead and just say hi. So we're not going to need to worry about the HTML tags here. So that's now saved. I refresh and we receive hi. So you can see that we're directly working now through our volume on our local machine. This is all stored on the local machine, but it's been copied across to our container, and you can see that it's working directly. Okay, so let's just put something a little bit more functional in here. So I've just copied and pasted this piece of code here. Hello from Nginx container. So that should just display just like that. So it's irrelevant what exactly you type here, but we've got something there in place so we can identify the page. Right, so we've created we understand about the default folder now. We've created our volume. So we've then served our custom page. So let's pretend now we're ready to serve this to our own server. So we want to now build a new image so that we can deploy that image into our actual server that we want to run our website in. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we have then is a folder here, HTML folder, with our index page that we want to serve on our live server. So we're going to make an image. So we're going to need to make sure that when we build an image, we want to actually put this in our image. So let's go back into here. So remember, this is kind of the setup details that is run when we actually build a new image. So first we're going to download this image. Obviously we've already downloaded that. So secondly, we want to make some sort of customization in this image. So we want to copy from HTML, index.html. We want to copy our HTML page over to the image folder. So Nginx, HTML, index.html. So we're going to copy our file over to this location here when we build a new image. Let me just zoom out a little bit. There we go. So that's the second step. So now we just need to build our image. So let's go ahead and do that. So run Docker and then build and then use the T flag and let's call this web server and then dot. So we give that a go. And then let's have a look. So let's go into our Docker. Let's go into images. So we should have our second image, and there it is. So that's the image that we've just created. So essentially what we've done here is we've downloaded Nginx before. That's the default image. We've taken this default image. We've copied our new file. So we manipulated that image or a new image to include this file, our own files. And then we created our own image from it. So now what we can do is run this web server image. So let's go back into our containers here. Just going to stop this container right here. And I'll just go ahead, and remove that. Okay, so let's go ahead now and start our new web server image. So we use a Docker command for this. So Docker run IT again, rm dp for ports. So we're going to run this on 8. Let's do 8080 port this time, just to show a little bit of difference. So let's give this a name. Let's call this web, and then we're going to run the web server image this time. Okay. Oh. Okay. So I forgot that. There we go. So now we've run our new image. So this image should come as standard with the index file that we put on there when we built the image. So when we refresh, you can see it doesn't work because we're using the wrong port. So let's go ahead and use the right port. And there we go. So we now have a custom Nginx image all ready and prepared for us to then potentially deploy on our own server. And there we go, an introduction to essentially Nginx, or utilizing the default Nginx image. Of course, there's 100,000 more things for us to learn, but hopefully that is a good start for us to work from. Now, in the next tutorial, we're going to be looking at the Nginx architecture. So for us to really understand Nginx, we need to have a basic understanding of what's happening behind the scenes. So the Nginx processes, we've already seen a snapshot of that in this tutorial when we looked at the processes that are running, the master process and the worker processes. So we're kind of drilled down a little bit into that and how that works. And that will give us a better understanding, like I said, of Nginx and how it works for us to then more effectively manage our Nginx service as we start to scale the services for multiple users. So that just leaves a big thank you to all the channel members. If you want to support the channel further, then please consider becoming a channel member or following us on Patreon. If you'd like to, we do have a number of different socials: Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Discord. So by all means, follow us on these socials. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.